introducing me and pointing out the general picture situation that the world is facing at the moment, the result, as you say, of not only the Great Recession of 2008-9 and the following what I call a long depression, very weak growth investment, wages stagnating in many countries over the last 10 years. And we seem to be heading into a new recession in 2019, just before the pandemic broke. And then we had the terrible 2020 COVID slump, which particularly was damaging to the so-called global south, or the poorer countries of the world who didn't have any support, fiscal and monetary backing, which at least to some extent in the advanced capitalist economies that took place. Then we had the supposed recovery in 2021, which was a recovery which has not taken most of these economies back to where they were at the end of 2019. And then we've had, as David said, this, as it were, a further hit, an agonizing hit, not only to the lives and livelihoods of the people of Ukraine and of Russia, and possibly even neighboring countries in the future, but also a huge hit, which is still having its repercussions across the world to the livelihoods, many millions and billions, if not, of people around the world. So all these things have been one hit after another, which, if you think about it, the 21st century for capitalism has hardly been a success story. This is not an example. We haven't seen 20 years of prosperity and growth, improved conditions for the vast majority of the world. What we've instead seen is increasing inequality, a series of crises one after another, and no improvement in the poverty of half the world's population, and increasingly difficulties for those in the so-called richer countries of the world. And now we have this Ukraine-Russian conflict. What does it mean in terms not only of its impact upon a small country like Ukraine, and a rather larger one, but still relatively middling, is the Russian economy? What does it mean for the rest of the world, including the UK? So that's what I wanted to talk about, if only briefly. And I'll be doing it from mainly an economic point of view. So as the IMF chief recently said, that the war in Ukraine was like a powerful earthquake that will have ripple effects throughout the global economy, especially in poor countries. And that's a very accurate statement of what is happening and what will happen over the course of 2022 and maybe beyond as a result of this conflict, depending on how long it lasts. What's the conflict all about? Well, I think we obviously can discuss that. And there have been many different points of view, not only in the wider media, but also amongst the left about what this conflict is about and who's right and who's wrong. I mean, is Ukraine fighting for democracy against the autocratic control imposed by Putin's Russia? Are they fighting for national independence? Is NATO a force for democracy and freedom against the autocratic powers like China and Russia? These are the arguments presented daily in the media. Putin is mad. He's like Hitler or Stalin that has launched this war against a peace-loving nation. And the TV pundit and comedian Zelensky, who's the president of Ukraine, is now a hero, similar to Churchill. Well, these are arguments that possibly we'll discuss, but I don't really want to talk about that level of debate. I want to look at the economic developments that are taking place in this discussion rather than those issues which daily feature the papers. And so I remind everybody that coming from a Marxist point of view, when we're looking at the Marxist conception of history, why these developments take place historically, it's not about really, most of the time, about individuals, but about the material forces and interests, particularly class interests, that lie beneath the surface and drive individual ideologies, political ideologies, and also political diplomacy and war. And as Marx and Engels once said, famously, all history hitherto is history of class struggle. And hitherto, I'm afraid, is still present, that we still have a class struggle as the basis of what's behind much of what goes on historically. And in that sense, when we're looking at class struggle, we're forced to look at the economic developments that are taking place. So economics cannot be divorced from politics, obviously. Each plays on the other. But as Friedrich Engels once said in the last analysis, history is driven by material conditions. And as Lenin also famously said, politics in the end is really concentrated economics. It's about the material interests, whether the prosperity and the improvement of the livelihoods of the masses and also of those that own and control the means of production is changed by political action, including war. And so that's what this war is about. It's about establishing, I would argue, a different economic order. Who's going to control Ukraine's resources, its wealth? Who is going to bring Ukraine into the orbit of Western capitalism? Or is it going to remain or be included as a vassal of Russia's Putin capitalism? Or is it going to be broken up into bits and shared out? That's not unusual in the history of Europe in particular, but also generally around the world. I think that's where politics becomes concentrated economics. So what do we mean about the economic situation? Well, again, I'm just doing some bit of theoretical work here before we get down to it, to point out, in my view, there are three key laws of Marxist political economy. The first is that what economies are about under capitalism is the law of value, that is, making profits. No production is done unless there's profit to be made out of it. No investment takes place unless there's more profit to be made out of it. And things are sold on the market to make a profit, not given to people, not produced for social need, but sold on the market to make a profit for those who own the means of production. And accumulating profits, whether it's in the financial markets or whether it's production of goods and services, that's the fundamental aim of the capitalist mode of production. So the second law is a continual accumulation of profits, and that's where production investment takes place. And the third law, key law, is that unfortunately for capitalism, they cannot continue the process of increasing profitability indefinitely. There's pressures and contradictions and pressures and tendencies within the capitalist system, which eventually produces a crisis between the need for more profitability and the need to increase production. Those two things come into contradiction, which is the key third law of Marxist economics. So in effect, the exploitation of human labor for profit is what capitalism is all about. There's a battle of a share of the profits between companies and national states over the share of that profit. And that includes, in this situation, a battle between, on the one side, if you like, the NATO alliance or the countries of the NATO alliance for control of the resources and the facilities both of Russia and Ukraine, and on the other side, Russian capitalism trying to preserve its position in Ukraine. That's what the battle is about. And the overall drive all the time is to try and improve and control trade, finance, and military positions internationally. So this is a battle between imperialist forces, if you like, as represented by NATO, led by the US, driving towards getting more profitability, and they're continually trying to preserve that political dominance in the world. The imperialist countries are those that are persistently have a strong position in technology, have basically control of trade, finance, and of course the military power to exert that economic domination over the rest of the world. And Lenin wrote a book in 1915, which he called Imperialism, the last or highest stage of capitalism. And 100 years later, really, it's no different. The same countries that were imperialist countries then that he talked about are the same ones now. And the same sorts of war that we had in 1914 and since have been about imperialism trying to control the world. They sometimes argue amongst themselves, but primarily the attempt is to control the rest of the world. And again, just have a quick look at this chart. This is wealth per capita, which is not a bad indicator of imperialist strength. And you can see the countries that are right up the top there are exactly what you'd expect them to be. You've got, apart from the oil-rich country of Norway, you've got the usual suspects. The red countries in this block are the G7, people mainly behind NATO, and the ones that are high up there in the blue, apart from the Netherlands and Korea, are also in the NATO bloc. So this is the military and political bloc in at least the western part of imperialism is there. Countries missing from NATO at the moment, Japan, Korea, and of course, when we go further to the right on this chart, you can see how weak in terms of wealth per head the other countries outside of the imperialist bloc are. Russia, which is supposed to be a major military power, it does have nuclear weapons after all, but where is it when it comes to its position economically in the world? It's nowhere really. It's weaker than China, in terms of wealth per capita now. And you can see where Ukraine is. It's a nothing country as far as imperialism is concerned, at least in terms of its position. But strategically, it appears to be very important for NATO to control that country. This is a power ranking provided by Tony Northfield, a Marxist economist, used to work in the city. He wrote quite a good book on the City of London, and he concentrates on imperialism. You can see he's added not just the GDP or wealth per capita, which I did earlier, but he's also added foreign assets of various countries, the banking size, the size of foreign exchange reserves, and the size of the military. And you can see that the US is by far the most powerful imperialist power in the world, mainly because it has that big red block of military power. Military spending, and the army of the US is bigger than the rest of the world's armies and military spending put together just on its own. It also has the big finance sector, banking sector, and so on. But its foreign assets are also huge. The stock of assets it has abroad that is invested in and which is to protect around the world from its multinational company. And its GDP is still large, but as you can see, countries like China are fairly close on GDP, but not much on anything else. As he's got China here as in second, but that's another question. But if you took China out of the equation, you can basically see that it's all the imperialist powers which I just showed before that are at the end. Where is Russia? Where is this great danger to the world? Right down here in nowhere as far as the imperialist rankings are concerned. And if we look at a Human Development Index, which is a measure made by the United Nations of basically the life expectancy, the prosperity, the human conditions available, was it a modern country, all that sort of thing is put into an index by the United Nations. And you can see that if you look back in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was, it was well above the world average, which was about 0.6 then on this index, so 7.73. China was well below, just under 0.5. India was even lower, of course, and you can see that the modern imperialist powers, the OECD countries, above the average, about 78. The US was way higher, but even Russia was higher than the world average. But you can see over the last 30 years, Russia's development index has improved, although you can see it fell after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. It was actually lower at the end of the 21st century. It's improved up to 2019, but it's now actually still above the world average, but well below the OECD at 0.9. But the big story of the last 30 years has been China's human development, now at 0.76, above the world average, and it's had a 50% rise in the last 30 years, while Russia has hardly moved at all. So although Russia in 1990 was a reasonably important economic power and well a military power, that has all deteriorated, certainly in the first 10 years after the Soviet Union, and hasn't really recovered to any sort of position of strength. So here we are now at this war, which has been launched. We'll argue about why, but let's just consider the impact that the war is having on the Ukraine economy alone. According to a senior economist at Oxford Economics, about 10 of the country's districts, provinces are totally disrupted. We know that something like 4 to 5 million people have been forced out of their homes and left the country. Maybe another 3 million are displaced across the country. And most of the areas that have been destroyed in the war are 60% of Ukraine's GDP and its exports. And the ports of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, which handle 75%, 3/4 of Ukraine's exports, have shut down. So the functioning of the economy has virtually collapsed. And according to the IMF, World Bank this week, they reckon that the Ukraine's GDP will fall by at least 30% this year. It'll probably be worse, more like 40%. It could even be, if the war continues for several months, that Ukraine's GDP will fall by 75%. What does that mean, GDP? It means its output, its ability to for people in Ukraine to live will drop by 75% on average. The damage will be massive, something like $1.3 trillion worth of damage, not only from the current war, but also from the war against the Kyiv launched against the eastern provinces back in 2014. And the graph on the right simply shows the blue line. That's where Ukraine was supposedly going to improve over the next 5 years to reach that sort of level of GDP. But then the 2014 war pushed them right back down on this yellow line, and then the trajectory rises again. And now we have the war now, which pushes them over there. So you can see the huge gap. This is permanent loss of livelihood, income, GDP, investment for the Ukrainian economy. Sure, it's only a small economy, but as we'll see, it's still very important. But let's consider the Russian economy. The Russians are now facing a massive attack upon their economy, launched by the West, mainly through a process of sanctions. We know the sanctions against the billionaires, who we call in Russia oligarchs. Of course, billionaires in the West are not oligarchs, they're just rich people. But the oligarchs in Russia are now being sanctioned, all Putin's friends, his cronies, and all those, and even the owners of Chelsea Football Club, all of them are being sanctioned in the efforts to crush it. And this is an important thing. It's a new weapon on the part, I think, of NATO and the West to launch economic sanction. NATO is happy for the Ukrainians to die for this war, for the struggle against Putin, but they're not going to send any troops themselves. But they're applying the weapons of economic sanctions, which were done also in previous wars as well. We're waging a total and economic and financial war against Russia, Putin and his government. So it's not just the oligarchs, it's not just attacking the Russian banks, but perhaps one of the biggest and most unprecedented measures of sanctions was to say that the Russian central bank's $600 billion worth of FX reserves they cannot use because they're in dollars and they're not held mostly in Russia at all. Those have been taken away from them. There's only 2 other countries that have suffered such a sanction. That's Venezuela and Iran. This is the first time one of the top 20 economies in the world has had its FX reserves stolen or taken away by the Western powers, and all the governments and central banks of the West are holding on to Russian funds and not allowing them to have it. Doesn't mean to say Russia's bust, because it's making huge oil export gains. Revenues on oil exports are up dramatically. But again, these are in dollars. Its banks are not able to spend this money abroad, so they have to be transferred into rubles. And so that means that in some ways, the Russian economy is now completely strangled in terms of trade and finance. And on that basis, the forecasts by most people now suggesting the IMF says 10%. Other people say that the real GDP for Russia will fall by 15% this year as the war goes on. So it will take the GDP, Russia's GDP, back to where it was basically almost at the beginning of this century. So in 1 year, it will lose its GDP growth. That's the actual national output. Each year will go back to the sort of levels it had at the beginning of the 21st century. Of course, it may recover and come back again, but you can see, as with Ukraine, if it comes back up here, it's certainly not going to be up there again. It's going to be a long time to get back there. So this is a disaster for the Russian people in its economy as a result of the war. And the sanctions, as I say, is something which is now increasingly be used. There's a very interesting book by somebody called Nicholas Mulder, who talks about how sanctions are being used as a tool of modern war, shaped by 3 factors. It's America's military dominance, its inflection of Cold War politics. In other words, Russia is always an enemy, whether it's capitalist or claims to be socialist. Doesn't make any difference. It's an enemy to US imperialism, and also the role that US financial markets can play in the world economy. The US may not be a manufacturing giant anymore. It may not be a trade leader like China is, but it certainly has the financial weaponry and, of course, the military weaponry. And if it doesn't use the military weaponry, it can use the financial. So, but from the point of view of the world, perhaps these are the 2 factors which are the most worrying, most concerning for the average household in Britain or elsewhere. Ukraine supplies 12% of the world's wheat exports, 16% of corn, and 40% of sunflower oil. And those are important commodities in the world's food production. And everywhere, energy and food prices are rocketing as oil embargoes from Russia supposedly imposed. And now we have this loss of granary throughout the world. Russian grain exports also being severely hit. This is hitting disastrously countries like Egypt, where 100 million people live in the country that's the largest importer of wheat in the world, but also it's hitting us as well. We've even before this war started, we knew that energy prices are rocketing in the UK and other countries, and now they're going to reach even higher levels of prices over the next few months, as if we continue the way, if this war continues at any length, particularly food. Just the day that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations announced that their food price index, which is a measure of food prices on average in the world, have reached an all-time high. An all-time high. There's never been as high at the moment food prices globally. And we obviously can see that to some extent in the shops here, but also in gas pump or petrol pump stations and so on. And of course, in our electricity bills as they hit. And you can see that all the prices of commodities produced by Russia and Ukraine in fairly large amounts have dramatically increased, and that includes raw materials, coal, wheat, corn, platinum. You can see the list down here accordingly. And the increase, the orange line is the increase just from the start of the war. That's how much prices have risen for various different commodities in this period of just the period of the war. And as I said before, this is the global raw materials price. It's now rocketed up. This is raw materials. That means minerals, various other things that go into production, and also energy has now reached a high that's not been seen since the Great Recession. And food price, as I said before, this is the food price measure I was talking about, at an all-time high by some distance as of this month. So, for example, in Britain, UK households face the biggest fall in living standards since the 1950s as a result of the inflation that's exploding across the world. UK inflation is hitting towards 8%. Today, the US inflation figure came at 8.5%. It's the same position in Eurozone, which is heading towards 7%. And yet, we're going to see a further hike in global energy prices that could cut real incomes, as I say, by something like 3% in the UK. The US figures I estimate today, we're going to see a cut in real incomes of the average American household of something like 2.5% in just 1 year. This is the biggest annual drop since 1956 in the UK, in the Suez crisis, another energy crisis. And this is going to affect particularly poorer households, mostly lower income families, who spend more on things like energy, food, and otherwise. I mean, the share going towards energy costs now is reaching the share that will go towards rents. It's just hugely increased. But more than that, this extreme strangulation of key commodities, of the collapse of production in various areas, is going to extend across the world. According to the OECD, the impact on global growth would be to reduce current global growth, which they thought was going to be around 4% this year. That's the average growth over the whole of the world, could be down by 1%. Inflation, as we just discussed, is going to be up maybe 2.5% from where it would have been. And we still have more commodity and financial shocks to come as a result of the deep recession in Russia, with the output declining there and inflation rising. And various areas, you can see on the right, this is the OECD's estimate. We could see a fall in Europe of about 1.5% in growth. And it's quite likely, I think, that Germany, by the summer, if this continues, is going to be in recession. Germany, the manufacturing power of Europe. We can see that other countries too are also going to suffer this level of reduction in growth. And it could be more than that. And if it's more than, say, 2%, then basically the world will be heading into a recession by the end of this year as a result of this war. Everything depends on how long the war lasts and what happens after that, how it's resolved, and what funding is done to right the situation. But a more general global result is the fact that what is this strangling, even with COVID, we saw the beginning of a tightening of openness in trade, the expansion of trade, which has been a key factor in the expansion of global capitalism, particularly since the 1980s. You can see the sharp rise that we had in trade and finance during the period from the 1980s up until the end of the 20th century. But you can see how really in the period since the global recession of 2008-9 and the long depression, that trade and finance have actually stagnated in the major capitalist economy. And now, with these hits that David was talking about of COVID and now the war, it's going to be a downward spiral. This is bad news. This is the sort of thing that hasn't happened since the 1930s, when globalisation also, to use a general word, meaning a general expansion of trade and finance by capitalist economies around the world. If you look on the right-hand side here, I've got a figure which shows the currency composition of FX reserves in various countries. Most countries, central banks hold their stock of FX reserves in dollars. And you can see the blue line here is the share that goes from not just dollars, but for the euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound. And you can see that over the period of the 21st century, that's been in a relative decline. Not a dramatic one. It looks a bit dramatic, but it's 58% there, down to 98% down to about 90%. So it's a decline. So the other currencies, like the Chinese renminbi, the Australian dollar, various currencies like that, small currencies, have increased their share. What does that mean? Well, again, here's a better picture of the dollar share of global official reserves. You can see that it's averaging around, used to be 70% in the 70s. It was still pretty high, around about 70% when the euro came. Euro didn't make much difference. The dollar is dominant in official reserves in the major economies' central banks. But there's been a slight gradual decline in the share held by central banks of dollars. Countries like Russia, China, India have tried to reduce their amount of dollars that they hold in reserves and try other currencies or hold gold, but not to a great extent. The US dollar is needed for trade, it's needed for finance, it's needed for payments of all sorts, particularly military and energy. And so the result is that it remains the major currency that is stocked up by governments who have got reserves in their central bank. And as I just said, that doesn't, unfortunately, for the case of the Russians, doesn't mean they've got that money because first, they can't spend it abroad anymore. And secondly, most of it is held in other central banks. And therefore, they've not been able to use these reserves to defend their currency. But there is clearly a general decline relative in the US dollar over a period of time. So this is a measure of the value of the US dollar against other currencies. And you can see back in the 1970s when Nixon took the US dollar off convertibility to gold, what that meant was that the dollar was worth a certain amount of gold, and it was guaranteed that you could have that certain amount of gold if you exchanged the dollar, if you wanted to. He took that off in 1971, which meant the dollar was then could be printed or produced as much as the central bank and the government of the US wanted to, and it wasn't tied to any amount of gold, and it was just based on the trust of what it was valued. You can see that gradually, over time, with different periods when it was shot up, particularly in slumps and recessions, there's been a decline in the value of the US dollar. Not great, but sufficiently to show that the US dollar is losing its dominance. I think that's a reflection of the relative decline of US imperialism as well, but not enough to transform the picture, as this particular war has shown. The US dollar and the US government and US imperialism and US military and US finances are still dominant enough, along with the coalition of the willing in Europe, to some extent unwilling to begin with, but now willing to wage a battle against Russia's Putin over the resources and control of the Ukrainian area, region, nation, government, for whatever cost to the Ukrainians. And that means that that demonstrates, I think, on the world scale, that those who talk about the end of US imperialism and its weakness, not right, because there is still a long way to go. In fact, there's talk in the liberal economic press that we're moving to a world of two blocks, if you like. The block of democracy, says Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, led by the great democratic nation of the world, the United States, and the block of autocracy and dictatorship as represented by Russia, China, Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, Iran, etc. Those who do not, on the whole, follow anything that the US imperialists want to happen. That's really the definition of it, although obviously these countries are also don't have the same sort of rights, political rights that exist for, at least in most cases, in the so-called West. So Wolf is saying that we're heading to a combination of war supply shocks and high inflation. Financial instability seems likely. We have a prolonged bout of stagflation. He means by that no growth in the economy, but high inflation, as we had in the 70s for a while. And this is causing the emergence of two blocs with deep splits between them, which will accelerate the reversal of globalisation and the sacrifice of business interests to geopolitics. Even nuclear war, says Martin Wolf, is a prospect that comes out of this war. IMF chief Georgieva pronounced that we live in a shock-prone world. The shocks are becoming thick and fast, she said, and we need the strength of the collective to deal with the shocks to come. Indeed, the collective will of the capitalist powers that can deal with it. Well, all I can say is if we're heading for a serious situation, includes war, or in the case of what Martin Wolf talked about, nuclear war, then not going to rely on the collective will of the capitalist powers to get us out of that. They failed over climate change. They failed to stop the COVID pandemic. They failed to end poverty or keep world peace. And I don't think we can expect to rely upon them. We need to rely upon the collective will of organized people, working people, to end the danger of war internationally and of this consequence. So what is missing perhaps of what I've just said is that if we are entering a new period where imperialism tries to deal with recalcitrant and resistant powers, the big battle is to come. This is a rehearsal, it seems to me, Ukraine, a rehearsal for what will happen in Asia between the United States and China. The United States' main aim is to squeeze, contain, and curb Chinese economic and political development and isolate it and reduce it and eventually get regime change they would have. That they can do this by trade and financial sanctions, by technological controls, but if they can't do it by that, they may even move towards some sort of military activity, perhaps using Taiwan as a pawn, like Ukraine has been used by the West against Putin's Russia. That is the sort of risk which exists over the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps quicker than that in the environment. Just 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, NATO had a special meeting in which the NATO foreign ministers, in which they invited not just NATO members, but also the foreign ministers of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, the Asian Western economies, if you like. And they were invited for the purpose of hearing from the Secretary General of NATO what the Russians have done in Ukraine. A price will have to be paid by the Russians. But not only that, they said, because China is not condemning Russia, and because it is giving tacit support, according to the Secretary General Stoltenberg, to Russia, then China will have a price for this. And the aim in June is to bring these four powers into a NATO alliance, which will work with the aim of sorting out Asia. And that is the aim after this Ukraine conflict, to move on to sorting out Asia, and in particular China, in the interests of the bloc of democracy against the bloc of autocracy. So that's a prospect politically, but also it means, in far as I can see, that we can hardly expect a very big improvement in the economies of the major countries over the next year or so, even if this war ends. It seems that this war could possibly provoke an economic recession within this next year, and we've only just come out of the COVID one. But even if it doesn't do that, we are entering a period of very poor and weak growth, low living standards, an inflationary environment which cuts real incomes for the average household, and the prospect of more divisions on trade and on finance, and possibly on political and military alliances over the next 5 to 10 years.